Nearly 13,000 customers remain without any water supply. Thousands more have a restricted supply. But looking beyond the current crisis, there's a much bigger problem with our water infrastructure. Earlier this week, Managing Director of Irish Water, Jerry Grant, says the company was facing real challenges. Do we have the funding? Do we have the resources to address these challenges? Well, Jerry Grant is with me in studio. Jerry, good morning and welcome.
Good morning, Pat.
Now, first of all, let's get an update on those without supply. How soon might they expect it? Why they don't have it? And those on restricted supply.
Yes, Pat. If I talk nationally, first of all, we are in relatively good shape across the country outside of Dublin at the moment. There are a couple of areas where we have restricted supplies still in East Meath and Longford, a number of local areas around the country. About 750 people without water, I think, still left. Other than Feathered. And Feathered is a particular case of a polluted supply, which is a really unfortunate new plant. And that is going to take us about 10 days to fully clean up and get back into full production.
It was contaminated with kerosene, isn't it?
Yes, it was a large kerosene storage which burst. The bund didn't hold for whatever reason, and it got into the River Anner, which ultimately meant that it got through into the plant and right through the plant before it was detected.
And do we know whose kerosene it was?
Well, we do, but I mean, all of that would be a matter for ourselves and Tipperary County Council to address.
And presumably insurers might come into
all
that,
of
because
that.
It's cost you a lot of money, I presume, to shut down this plant and clean it out.
Well, I'd have to say, I mean, we're facing a couple of €100,000 of costs, of course, but I mean, the local meat processing plant had to get rid of some supplies. Farmers are in some difficulty, and I know we're working with Glanbia to share all the information with them to make sure that the quality of milk is protected and so on. So there's been real hardship for people, and again, I want to note that as in most rural communities, the community effort, farmers helping farmers and so on, is tremendous down there at the moment. But this was a new plant, Pat, cost €11 million, only opened last year, and it just demonstrates how vulnerable to pollution and to careless control of chemicals these plants are.
Can it be restored to the way it was? I mean, will it be pristine when it finally reopens?
That I can assure you. Absolutely assure you. We're taking out all of the filter sand. All of the pipework throughout the plant will be fully cleaned out. Tanks, pipelines, the whole lot cleaned down, and significant testing done. So the HSE will have to be fully satisfied that there are no traces of hydrocarbons, because I mean, these will be detected by people in taste and so on, even if they were below health limits. So we will not put the plant back into production until we're fully satisfied, because that area deserves the same quality of water as everywhere else. And as I said, the investment was made. We'll make sure it goes back to its original condition.
Let's talk about those unrestricted supply.
Yes, restricted supply is a feature of water schemes where there isn't sufficient headroom in the system. Basically, if you look at our problems now in the days following the thaw, we have difficulty everywhere where the production capacity is only marginally ahead of demand. So the Greater Dublin area is obviously the most obvious one, but equally places like East Meath, the Lough Mass scheme has been under pressure in Mayo, and this really just picks out for us the schemes that we already know require to be upgraded, new sources of water added or augmented. By the way, before I go further, could I simply say a word to all the people who have been without water, certainly for 3 or 4 days? It becomes a real hardship, and I'm desperately conscious of that. That is why, of course, we're trying to manage the restrictions. And I also want to have a big call out to not only our own staff in Irish Water, but the local authority staff all across the country, but especially the southeast and the east coast. In the Dublin area, for example, the engineers and crews are now working flat out long after the episode has passed, and will be for weeks to come, right through the weekend. And I want to thank them all and acknowledge the professionalism, by the way, that has gone into trying to manage these restrictions. I've said it's a crude instrument, and I can explain that if you like, but in terms of trying to manage pressures, there's no easy way of doing it, and it takes real skill and understanding of the network to try and tailor it so that you're not hurting people unduly.
The issue for some people who are particularly at the far extremities of the network, the pressure is there at the beginning of the pipeline, but if you're at the top of a hill somewhere, it could take a long time for the water to reach you at lowered pressure, or it might never reach you at all.
Well, I've been reflecting on this because you're absolutely right, the extremities of systems on high ground, but also complex buildings and tall buildings. So in Rathmines and Rathgar, for example, we have old buildings that are very tall. Sometimes the plumbing isn't very good. They have airlocks and so on. Some of the older apartment blocks in particular, I think people are in trouble. So I would ask building managers, for example, now to have a look at apartments.
You mean some of those might be depending on the pressure in the system to elevate the water to the tank on the roof when they really need a pump? an internal pump.
And they may not have pumps. They should have pumps, of course, because we don't guarantee pressures more than about 15 metres.
So if your building is an old Georgian building and the tank's in the attic, the natural pressure that you will supply, now you may supply greater pressures at different times, but the pressure that you'll supply at the moment will not get the water into the tank.
That's precisely the problem, and that's why we're having calls from people. And our job at the moment is to try and get back to individuals. It's now very much about individuals. I think yesterday we only had a relatively small single-figure number of calls about no water in Dublin. The previous day, though, it was well over 100, and these were people who were having real problems, even though the supply was back in the area. And it emphasises the fact that this is no way to run a distribution system. This is not how you can run a distribution system for any length of time. So we have to get back to a stable position very quickly.
Now, just to get to the fundamentals of this, people say in a country where it rains all the time, surely we have enough water. Well, we do have enough raw water. Those reservoirs that we see at the outskirts of Dublin City and other cities, they're full.
Well, if we start at the big picture, you're right. Currently, at the start of March and after the thaw, the raw water reservoirs at Paula Fuca and the Liffey and Vatry are relatively full. What we have to consider, of course, is that through a cycle of 20 or 30 years, through the dry periods, what is the limiting capacity? And we believe that that's probably around 550 to 600 million litres from our existing sources. We can run those at up to 640 million litres, in normal conditions when the weather provides the water. Our treatment capacity is normally good for about 640. The Vatry, however, gets hit regularly with algal blooms. It will take us 2 years to build a new treatment plant to deal with that. So prior to this event, we were down 30 to 40 in the Vatry, which meant we were on about 600. Demand had gone up in the last year by about 2 to 3% to about 590. So you can imagine just how tight we were.
So the idea that you're balanced, so that's fine, that's no good, because in the event of any emergency, for example, the feathered emergency where you had pollution, can you envisage a situation where the Liffey, from which you draw an awful lot of your water, if something happened there?
Absolutely. We carry out risk assessments in all our schemes, and the Dublin system is nowhere near the level of security of a city region across Europe.
You would give an example of we had pollution there from the kerosene where the tank exploded, but you could have, say, an oil spillage if a tanker went off a motorway, for example.
Well, the M4 runs by the Leakage Reservoir. Should you have an accident there with a chemical, kerosene, or indeed some other chemical, that would knock out the Liffey, that would knock out 30%, 35% of the total production capacity.
And for how long? You're talking about weeks.
Well, you're talking I suppose the issues could be quite serious if it got into the plant. So it's hard to predict. But the point is, you can't be in that position. You have to have enough for, first of all, when you're talking about the average day demand, you need a peak factor on that, because you have tourism, you have high tourism periods, you have periods of high production. So you need 7, 8, 9, 10% peak production. You also need about 13 to 15% headroom. Headroom is what other water utilities consider the minimum margin that they need to give them contingency.
And what is that? Is it a day's supply, 2 days supply, a week's supply in reserve, a buffer, in other words?
You need at least 48 hours of storage across your system, plus the capacity to produce 15 or 20% more than you need on an average day.
And we're running at 100% all the time, pretty much.
And of course, Pat, you also need multiple sources. You can't be relying on single sources. We take 85% of our water from the Liffey, and we take 40% of all the Liffey water, which is quite extraordinary. So,
and were you dismayed then when people along the Shannon were given out about taking less than 1%?
Well, I'm not dismayed about it. I think every project needs to be rigorously tested, and I fully understand that communities and stakeholders have to have assurance that it's a valid project. People talk about leakage in Dublin, and we are committed to bringing leakage down as much as we can. But the practical reality of leakage is we now have to recover about 30 million litres due to Storm Emma alone. And we want to get another 45 million litres just to meet the demands in the next 4 or 5 years. So therefore, a new source must come in the next 5, 6 years for Dublin.
The argument always is, though, Jerry, that unless you stop the leaks, and we know about the first fix free and all the rest of it. This text from Gary: I'm sick and tired of Irish Water going on about people leaving their taps running, because I don't think it's as bad as they say. I reported a leak at a derelict house last September. Nothing has been done about it because it's private property. 6 litres a minute, then work out the hours, the days, the weeks, the months. You do the math. Well, it is millions of litres a year on that basis. What about that? You know, people observe water flowing into the gutter and they say, why isn't that being fixed?
Well, of course, there are public and private leakage. Just to talk about leakage for a minute, on the private side, good progress was made with the first fix scheme, but people have responsibility for leakage on their side of the stopcock, and we can't go into properties, we've no right to go into properties to fix leaks without permission. So we have to get consent for every private side.
Don't necessarily know. I mean, there are people who didn't want meters, resisted meters, and there are people who were never offered meters because the program stopped at a particular point. And how are they to know that on their property there is a leak?
Well, I mean, you could know. First of all, your pressure may well be down. Just to give you an example, though, we read the meters in Dublin, read an area of meters in Dublin during the week, and we found 40 leaks that had between 20 cubic metres and 80 cubic metres per property. Now, that's 20 cubic metres will service 50 houses. So the equivalent of 50 houses up to the equivalent of 200 houses in individual leaks in properties.
And that was due to looking at the meters.
That was reading the meters, yes.
Yeah. What was causing those leaks? I mean, was it as a result of subsidence because of the frost, the snow and all of that? Or were these leaks that had been there for a long time?
They may well have been burst service pipes resulting from the frost, and that's the most likely cause. A hose running full out will lose that amount of water. But just to mention the public side. On the public side, before Storm Emma, we had 200 million litres of leakage in our system, about 36 or 37% across the Greater Dublin area. That's the Dublin area leakage, much higher in the country generally.
So that's stuff that you have responsibility for?
That's stuff that we have responsibility for. Looking at the best efforts that we can make in terms of find and fix, pressure management and replacement of pipes at a reasonable rate, higher than we're doing at the moment, maybe up to 1% per annum, the best we can do is get that down to about 30% in the next 4 or 5 years and eventually down to the low 20s. By comparison with UK utilities, that would be a tremendous performance.
What is the norm across the developed world, do you know, for an acceptable level of leakage?
It varies enormously. The best countries for leakage are Northern European countries like the Netherlands and Denmark and countries like that, where they've completely replaced their systems in the last 30 or 40 years. They're down in single figures. Paris would be probably 10%.
Even perfection is around the 10% mark.
Oh, absolutely. But if you have a mix of pipes like we have, which is PVC, asbestos cement, 25% cast iron with 9,000 kilometres, in that kind of system, to get below 20% is practically economically impossible because the leaks are generating all the time. To give you another point, when we fix a leak for, say, 20 cubic metres in a property, the amount of that saving that ends up back at the plant is probably a third of that, because what's happening there is when you fix that leak, the pressure to the neighbouring properties improve and they get better supplies, so they use a bit more water. And the leaks, of course, that are around the place leak a little bit more.
So more pressure because you've sealed one leak means more. It could even create another leak.
Absolutely. So you need to fix about 3 leaks for the equivalent saving of 1. So the task of leakage reduction is a mammoth task that never eases. We're building a programme, and we've been working very closely with the 4 Dublin local authorities, Kildare and Wicklow, for example, to get an integrated programme across this region, separate altogether from Storm Emma, which will make the savings that will keep this city going until such time as we can get the new source in, because the new source is going to take us until 2025, and that's with a fair wind and the planning permission coming through and all the rest of it.
So we are pretty much in crisis. Now, we haven't talked about the Vartry Tunnel. It's been inspected. I know you had the cameras up there on a number of occasions. I mean, is that holding or is it deteriorating further?
Well, nobody knows because nobody has been in it since in the last 20 years. But we started work on a pipeline to bypass the Vartry Tunnel. That's the good news.
How long is the Vartry Tunnel?
It's about 4 kilometres.
4 kilometres. So you've got to build a new 4 kilometre.
We're doing a new pumped pipeline which will bypass the tunnel entirely. That's under construction. And we're
How long to build that?
Probably 15 months. About 15 months.
Okay, and that will alleviate the pressure in which particular areas?
Well, what that will do is it will stop the leakage from the tunnel. It'll also stop the leakage into the tunnel, which is a threat to water quality. So you see, we take water from the Vartry, we want to have it arrive at the destination in the condition we send it out. Unfortunately, the tunnel was leaking in, which poses a threat to
what sort of stuff is getting into the
groundwater,
tunnel?
But there's a risk with groundwater that it may have cryptosporidium, it could have contamination of other kinds.
The question of water treatment, we know that when they built the water treatment plant in Dublin in Ringsend, that within a very short time it was at capacity. What to do about that? I mean, there is a plan for a Baldoyle treatment plant. I'm not sure where that is at the moment. but you desperately need more capacity, and at the same time, you're treating all the stormwater.
So if we touch briefly on first of all, drinking water and then wastewater. On drinking water, standards changing all the time. The European Commission has a new draft directive now, which is going to bring the lead standard down to 5 microns, for example. So drinking water challenges, right now across the country, we have 400,000 people where we can satisfy the trihalomethane standard. So we have to upgrade our plants to meet these standards all of the time. Pesticides is becoming a risk in some of our plants around the country. On the wastewater side, you're right. In the Dublin area, the plant that was built removed the BOD, but not the nitrogen, not the phosphorus. The new plant that we're going to spend 400 million. We've just started an 80 million phase of that in Ringsend, which will bring the capacity from 1.6 to 2.4 million eventually, and take out the nitrogen and the phosphorus. That's a 400 million investment. That will cater for the needs of Dublin, except for the northern environs. So we're also bringing to Bortlanala, hopefully during the coming year, the proposal for a new northern scheme in off the Malahide Road, and a tunnel interceptor which will intercept Mulhuddard, Blanchardstown and all of that area and bring it out to the Irish Sea.
But the question of treating wastewater, I know that our infrastructure is not such that you can separate out easily, but there's got to be a case for doing work into the future that means you don't treat the stuff that just comes down the shores.
Yeah. Well, I suppose when we set out the Water Services Strategic Plan, the 25-year plan, and we posited a figure of about 13.5 billion as the shortfall in the assets, we were including those kind of things because after we've done all the stuff that we've been talking about this morning, we have all that work to do on the Victorian tunnels, which are leaking in and overflowing into the Liffey. Right across the country, Cork City, we're spending 7 or 8 million with cameras trying to figure out where all the sewers are and what condition they're in, because we're getting salt water pumped out to our treatment plant. We're getting huge amounts of stormwater picked up and pumped into the treatment plant, which is costing us a fortune.
Yeah.
So there's a massive job, but we won't be able to do all of that at once. So clearly we're talking about billions of euros running out for 20 years.
Does water harvesting recommend itself to Irish Water, or is that nobody's business? You see, the problem is because there's no charging regime, there's no incentive for people to collect water from their roof and use it to wash clothes or even water their garden in dry spells. No incentive there at all.
I suppose the problem with water harvesting is that, first of all, it's very marginal in the scheme of things, because a leak in your toilet is going to leak far, far more than what you use in normal consumption. So it's a challenge to justify it from that point of view. The other issue with water harvesting is that your plumbing system has to be very carefully set up in your house, because you have to have two supplies and you can't have them cross-contaminate. So it's challenging economically for the householder.
But should it not be in the building regulations now for all new builds? We're going to build a huge number of houses and apartments over the next 20 years. There's no time like now to do it right.
And that's how you would do it. You would bring it in now as part of building standards and ensure that going forward the property has that option, because it's impossible to expect people to retrofit it.
Some of the questions and comments coming in the last 2 years since Irish Water was set up, how have they improved the percentage of water lost to leaks, or have they? And how much is lost on the Irish Water side before it gets to the private side to houses? That's from Tom and Mayo.
I think we've taken out nationally about 4% in terms of water savings, which is, it's about about 100 million litres of water savings.
Now, people might think 4% is very small in terms of fixing leaks.
But I go back to the point that when you have a system like ours, that's essentially a sieve. Fixing leaks is a constant battle, and what you've got to do is accelerate the pace at which you're doing it. And then we've replaced, I think, about 1,000 kilometres of the worst pipes in the system. So that's an improvement, but it's only a start.
Can you ask that man to come clean on the massive loss of water this week? Is it burst pipes, not taps left running? You can see it for yourself. Crews all over the country repairing the supply mains. That's from David in Sligo.
The best we can say is that in the Greater Dublin area, we think demand went up by a total of 60 million litres after the thaw. It looks now as if we got about 25 or maybe even 30 of that back on the Monday, when people went into premises and shut off all the leaking pipes and all the burst pipes and so on. Maybe it wasn't quite that high, but at least 20. The balance is then underground. So I would think that at least 30 of it is underground, and maybe another 30 was initially in premises, running taps, people taking precautions for.
But you've no idea how much of it is, if you like, your responsibility, because if it's underground, it can be privately underground or it can be in the public domain.
I would expect that the vast bulk would be the public system. The vast bulk is the public system. What I'm talking about is on Monday, and this reflects the fact that, and by the way, Birmingham had problems on Monday, so had Thames, so had Anglian Water, all because people were running their taps. We've been doing that too, and the reality is on Monday, when people got into the premises, into vacant premises, and went back to businesses and shut off all those systems, we got a significant saving. Now, it got back perhaps half of the total. The rest, I'm afraid, is for us to do in the longer term.
Could you ask your guest, please? We live in Rathfarnham. The water is back every morning, but unfortunately the water is so brown. We've been asked not to waste water, but what should we do with that brown water? Keep using it for showers and brushing teeth, or are we allowed to run it until it becomes clear? That's from Auntie.
I think that's extremely difficult, and I have huge sympathy for the fact that they may wish to run it freely for a little time, because that is a problem of resuspension of iron deposits in the pipes. So and this is a huge issue. This is it's
unsightly, but is it safe?
Well, it's safe. There's no bacterial issue there, and there's no fundamental health issue. But of course, aesthetically, it's terrible, and it's a function of the fact that you can't run a system like this. This is not a way to run a system. So we've got to get back to having the pipes full and not have these interruptions. So I sympathise. I would suggest that perhaps they should run it for a minute or two and see as it get clear.
People are always giving out about Irish water and talking about bonus cultures and all the rest of it. Do you believe that having this centralised control of the provision of water is better, much better, a lot better than having all the local authorities doing the job? I know they're still subcontracting to you as Irish Water, but do you think it is a better way?
Pat, there has never been an issue with the people, with the engineers or with the caretakers or with the superintendents, but a single national utility in the last few years has made a massive difference. We have strategic plans for the first time. We have standards for the first time. We have multi-annual investment programs. We have operational processes. We're going into plants and optimising the processes and helping and supporting those operational people. We need to move gradually over the coming years towards a more integrated...
Do you believe there was gross neglect? Because it's been said many times, because the pipes are underground, they're not visible, so easy for local authorities to ignore.
I'd love if people could come into Colville House and see the systems that we have now. You couldn't call it neglect. You can't have fragmented utility capabilities across 31 local authorities. The systems...
But is that what happened? That because you don't see the mains, that local authorities could put their limited funding investments elsewhere?
Absolutely. And if you don't have data, you don't see the problem. If you collect the data and you have the analytics, you paint the picture. We knew we had a crisis in Dublin. We were hit with this. By the way, Storm Emma wasn't the worst kind of freeze you could have. If it happened in January, the temperatures would have been lower, the days would have been shorter, and this would have been more severe. So this is a real lesson for us in terms of the challenges we face. But the only way out of this is the utility working with the industry right across the sector, continuing the investment plans, improving the operational practices and building the resilience into the system.
Technical question from a listener or a comment. We need to use groundwater, not surface water. There would be no contamination issue with groundwater. I mean, farmers and others in group schemes use groundwater rather than...
I wish that were true. We have a lot of groundwater sources. Most of our groundwater sources in Ireland are shallow. We have nitrate problems, we have cryptosporidium problems, we have bacterial problems. That was one of the dangers. Places like Waterford, had a lot of groundwater sources which just were not equipped to provide the quality when contamination occurred. Whitegate, we discovered a groundwater source had actually surface contamination, and we had to put in full treatment there. So there are no safe drinking waters in this country that unless you provide proper treatment.
You've got to treat. I'm in Kilkenny. We've no water this morning. No mention of this. We're on the Bennett's Bridge supply. The helpline person had no info. That's from Seamus. Any info on Bennett's Bridge?
No, I don't this morning. I haven't heard of it this morning, but we have recurring bursts every day of the week, and we'll certainly check it out and make sure the information goes up on our website.
I'm a small business owner in the Feathered area. I've struggled to get analytical information on the water contamination so that I can risk assess my operations. Why does Irish Water shroud itself from business and the public?
I would hope that we never shroud ourselves from the business and the public. We provide all our information to the HSE, by the way, and they would have it available. We publish it all on our websites. We're only getting back this morning. Yesterday morning, I think we got the results from the hydrocarbon issues. I would like to get in touch with that person and give them the information, because I have no difficulty whatsoever sharing. I'm from Feather, by the way. I know that place very well. Okay. It's a gorgeous town, and it doesn't deserve to have this visited on it.
57% of water is lost through leaks. Fixing these rather than ramming in meters would have been the way to go.
Well, look, the meters were put in as a political decision to collect revenue, and they have the benefits of helping us conserve water. We now know what our domestic consumption is. You know, in the UK, they were quoting leakage figures for years based on estimates of domestic consumption of 140.
But you have enough meters now to know, meters in various kinds of dwellings to know what typical consumption is.
We have 60% coverage, which means that we now know what the average householders use. We also know that 7% or 8% are using a hell of a lot more. And as I said, there's no mystery now about what domestic consumption is, and therefore we know what the leakage is accurately.
Sounds to me there isn't enough water for population growth. That's from Brian in Dublin.
It's a desperate struggle in the next 5 or 6 years to make sure that we get enough leakage back and we maximise the existing sources to meet the needs, but we absolutely must get that major scheme in, and within the period of 6 to 7 years.
I've reported a leak at the water meter 4 times since it was installed. Each time received follow-up call, but no repair carried out. That's from Dave in Cork. I don't expect you to know the minutiae of all of that. Congratulations to Paul Murphy and the Hard Left for winning a battle for the minority, but losing a very significant war for the majority. That's from Richie in Mayo. Pat, leaks on private property. Irish Water can search on the land registry to see if there's a mortgage charge on the title, then get consent from the charge holder to enter the property. Mortgage deed will allow access in these emergency situations.
Well, I mean, you know, we want people to fix their leaks. For us to have to go through processes like that takes months. You know, it's not a tenable way of doing business. People have to take responsibility for the water that they take beyond the stopcock.
The people want a water supply, but they won't pay for it, says another. What an amazing gentleman, so knowledgeable. Our water service in this country is in very safe hands. A nice compliment here. Let's conclude though by talking about the Shannon. There may be planning difficulties, but the theory is fairly straightforward. Now, you did want to run it from, was it Lough Ree, run it into a big buffer reservoir on one of the cutout bogs and then on to Dublin. You've changed the plan. Now, in engineering terms or planning terms, why?
Through the process of consultation and engagement with all of the stakeholders, it became pretty clear to us that any abstraction from Lough Ree might have an environmental impact that we couldn't foresee or couldn't fully mitigate. In other words, we tested it, we ran the models, and given the sensitivities of the Shannon Callows and of Lough Derg downstream, we couldn't eliminate the risk of an environmental impact on flora, fauna, and so on. So therefore, we looked at the other options. We eventually decided that the Partine Basin represented the most secure option, because at that point the water has flowed through the entire length of the Shannon system down as far as Eireann. So all of the environmental benefit has been obtained. Taking it to that point means we're simply taking it from the ESB, who would otherwise use it for power generation. So it was the least environmentally impactful option, slightly more expensive, but much more secure in the long term.
And impacting on them very much? I mean,
about 2% of their power generation
would be
offset.
That's at times of regular flow. Sometimes there's a lot more water than that they need. So okay, and that will then go into a reservoir or go straight to.
No, because Partine is a reservoir already, and there's a very significant control in that reservoir. The ESB have a tremendous resource there. We can take it directly from there and pump it directly to Dublin. Although we're pumping it to a high point in Cloughjordan, and from there it'll flow by gravity into Dublin. And the beauty of that is we can take offtakes for Portlaoise, Mullingar, and other places along the way, because this is a scheme that will service the Midlands, probably up into the Meath catchment, the Boyne catchment as well, which is very tight for water, and the Greater Dublin area.
Yeah. How many million litres per hour or whatever is planned?
Well, it's about 330 million litres ultimately, which is about 4 tonnes per second or 4 cubic metres per second.
And it's only a drop in the ocean.
Which is the same as Ballymore Eustace, by the way.
Really?
That's the amazing thing about Ballymore Eustace. I mean, I would have to say the ESB engineers back in the 1930s built a fantastic resource there, which has saved Dublin, really. And to think that we can get that amount of water in the upper Liffey is phenomenal.
Future-proofing then, because the Victorians did, to a large extent, future-proof what they built. That Shannon supply, how far into the future will that guarantee our water? We're
pretty certain that with that scheme, the Liffey system and the battery system reconstituted, and an abstraction from the Barra that we have at near Athy, we can get to 2050, and that's what we're planning at the moment. And that's the kind of horizon you have to plan for, because these are huge investments and there's no point in having short-term horizons on them.
Jerry Grant, what an education this morning. The Managing Director of Irish Water, thank you very much for joining us in studio today.